The cumulative value of those 4 apartments in this case could be £300,000. Isn't that just £100,000 of equity we've created from thin air? Well, yes it is. What exactly is freehold to leasehold title splitting, and why and how does it actually exist? And if you add up the rental from each of those units, it's a lot more than it would be if they rented the entire property to one family. We are not going to be like that original landlord who took a big property and subdivided it. Yes, of course you can do that. However, building regulations are very strict these days. It can cost a lot of money, but I'm talking about a much easier strategy where someone has already done the work for it. They've already done the refurb work. And the way the leases are created is you get a solicitor to literally look at the floor plans, draw them up, etc., create the leases. They might charge you several £1,000s to do that, but then the individual apartments can be sold separately. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Property Magic Podcast. Now in this episode, I'm going to talk all about the freehold to leasehold title splitting strategy. Now, if you listened to last week's episode, you know I was talking about creative finance, ways of you investing in property and controlling property using very little of your own money. And I finished that by talking about the freehold to leasehold strategy, which really is property magic, because you literally create equity from thin air. Now, we had a lot of emails and inquiries into the PIN office about that, so I thought I'd go into a bit more depth about this. Now, I only have a limited amount of time, so I want to give some really headline information in this episode of the podcast. But remember, I am doing a live online training in much more detail about how you can use freehold to leasehold title splitting. Now, it's normally a strategy that we teach on my 3-day Accelerator program, where we cover all of the strategies from the year-long mastermind. So it's one of the strategies we teach on that. However, I am revealing all of the details for free on this 90-minute masterclass. So click on the link in the show notes. You can come and register for that live online training with me. So let's first of all talk about what exactly is freehold to leasehold title splitting, and why and how does it actually exist? And then we'll talk about how can you find the opportunities. So what you need to imagine, let's go back in time a little bit. So you had some landlords who had a property, a large property, and they could either rent that property out to one group of tenants, maybe a large family, or they could take the property, do a little bit of work to the property and create individual self-contained units within that bigger property. And they often found they can get a lot more rental income by renting a smaller self-contained unit, and if you add up the rental from each of those units, it's a lot more than it would be if they rented the entire property to one family. It's a bit like the concept behind an HMO. An HMO, a house of multiple occupation. We have a house, you have individual rooms, and then you have shared facilities. You certainly have a shared kitchen, maybe a shared living room, and sometimes shared bathrooms, although increasingly in HMOs, people have en suites where they have their own shower, hand basin and toilet. So it's a similar kind of concept in that you make a lot more rental income from all of these individual rooms than you would if you rent out the whole house. But the major difference, and people often get confused here, an HMO has shared facilities, whereas when you do a freehold to leasehold title split, it's very important that you find apartments or flats where they are fully self-contained and they do not have shared kitchens or shared bathrooms. So that's a really important first distinction for you to understand. A previous landlord has decided, if I break these into small self-contained units, I can get a lot more rent if you add up all the individual rents than I would renting the whole property. So that's why these things exist in the first place. Now, what we're doing is we're looking for those freehold buildings, and it's very important that it is a freehold building, where the individual units have already been created. And again, we're not going to be like that original landlord who took a big property and subdivided it. Yes, of course you can do that. However, building regulations are very strict these days. It can cost a lot of money, what with sound insulation, etc. So yes, you can do it, but I'm talking about a much easier strategy where someone has already done the work for it. They've already done the refurb work. And very often we can find a property that needs literally no work doing to it at all. The current owner might have recently refurbished all of the units. Now, usually we do need to do some work. We might do a cosmetic makeover, but there's no structural work at all. There's no planning permission required because that would have been granted initially. And there's even no building regulations because we're not changing anything on the property. We're just replacing what's already there, maybe. But as I said, sometimes we don't even have to do that. So again, we're looking for this freehold property that's been split into individual units. It might just be 2 apartments. It might be a block of 8 apartments. Okay, so that's the first thing we're looking for. Now, when we find an opportunity, and by the way, here's how you find them. You can go into Zoopla or Rightmove. You can do a search in your area. Now, whilst you might normally be looking for properties up to a certain level, do not have any maximum level at all. And you might normally be looking for 3 or 4 bedroom properties. Instead, you want to look for properties that are 8 or more bedrooms, and then do a search to see what comes up. Now, of course, if you're looking for properties with 8 more bedrooms with no price limit, up will come loads of amazing homes that would be great to live in, but try not to get too distracted looking at the wonderful homes which you might like to live in one day. What we're looking for, as I said, is those properties that have been split into individual units. Now, Rightmove doesn't have a classification for that, but when you look at the description, you can see it might say it's 8 bedrooms consisting of 4 2-bedroom apartments, for example. So it's looking at the description, and sometimes the pictures you can also see the properties being split into flats. For example, you might see the front of the building with lots of dustbins outside. That could be an indication that actually it's a block of flats already. So remember, it must be freehold. That's the first thing. Then you want the work has already been done, and you can find them on Zoopla and Rightmove as I've just described. Now, when you find an opportunity, here's what you need to do next. You need to first of all check in the description that they are fully self-contained and they are indeed a freehold block you can buy. If someone has already created the leases, and the way the leases are created is you get a solicitor to literally look at the floor plans, draw them up, etc., create the leases. They might charge you several £1,000s to do that, but then the individual apartments can be sold separately. Prior to that, where they were just rented, there was no need to create the leases. And so that's why most landlords who own these buildings never bothered to do that, because they didn't need to. Why would you spend money on legal fees if you don't need to do it? Now, you might be thinking, well, hang on a minute, surely all property owners, all landlords will be aware of this. That's the amazing thing. They're not aware of this, and most estate agents do not know about this either. I'm giving you some highly advanced information here that most people are just not aware of. They might have heard about it, but they really don't understand it. Now, why is this so attractive? Well, let's say, and I'll keep the numbers really simple here. Let's say we could buy a freehold property for £200,000. And someone in the past has already created 4 individual 1-bed apartments. Now, those 1-bed apartments might be worth maybe £75,000 each as a leasehold property. So if there are 4 apartments at £75,000 each, 4 times 75 is £300,000. But hang on a minute, we can buy this property as a block for £200,000, and if we just get a solicitor to create the leases on this property, the cumulative value of those 4 apartments in this case could be £300,000. Isn't that just £100,000 of equity we've created from thin air? Well, yes it is. Now, of course, there are some costs there. There are some legal costs to split the leases. But if you can find a property where you can buy the property for less than 75% of the cumulative value. So let's be clear in the example I used earlier. A £200,000 property, if that's less than 75% of the cumulative value, which let's say it's 300,000, 75% of 300,000 is 225. So in this case, the purchase price is less than 75% of the cumulative value. What it means is you could buy them and effectively refinance all of those properties to ensure you can actually take all of your money out. So this is an example of momentum investing. You could borrow the money from someone else. In fact, there are some very clever ways where you don't need any money to do this at all, but I haven't got time to mention those in this episode of the podcast, but I will do it on the 90-minute live online training I'm doing. So maybe go and click on a link and register for that. If you're watching the video version of this podcast, there's going to be a link in the description below the video. So click on that, come and register for that live online training with you. I've got time to go into a lot more detail than I have on this quick episode of the podcast. So you're looking for this freehold property that's completely split before. There are a few more details I need to give you before you get too excited about this. Very often we find a freehold building that's been split into individual apartments, but sometimes they're quite small. They're studio apartments. If you want to remortgage each of the individual units in the future, it's very important that the size of the properties is a minimum 30 square meters. So you've got to check that each of the units is going to be at least 30 square meters. Otherwise, it can be very difficult to refinance any units that are less than that. The other thing is you also want to make sure that the original owner splits the utility supplies. So in other words, each property should have its own electric meter. If it's got gas to the building, sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. It should have its own gas meter and ideally its own water meter as well. Now, sometimes within blocks, sometimes landlords pay for some of the bills and they might include it as part of the rent. I've lived in apartments where that's definitely been the case. But ideally, we want separate utilities so that you can easily sell these as individual units. It'd be very hard to do that if they were sharing the gas central heating, for example. So not every opportunity you find will meet these criteria. That's why it's being important to be very clear on exactly what you're looking for. Once you've found something like this, don't tell the agent who's selling it what you plan to do, because they may not be aware of this strategy. In fact, they probably won't be aware. But if you explain to them what you're looking to do, they might think, oh God, that's a good idea. Pick up their little black book and call some of their top investors and get their investors to buy it. So don't explain to the estate agent what you're going to do. So what that means is when you're doing your due diligence, when you want to say, okay, what would each of these be worth as an individual apartment, you don't want to speak to the agent who's selling that block. You want to come and speak to another agent who's not even aware of this property and just talk to them generally about properties in that area that are already apartments, that are leasehold apartments, the similar size, similar kind of age, etc., to make sure you're comparing like with like. That's how you can work out what the individual units might be. And remember, we want to work out the cumulative value to ensure that the purchase price is less than 75% of that cumulative value. And if it is, there's a pretty good chance you could buy these and refinance it and get all of your money out. Bear in mind, when you split the leases, when you go to refinance each of these properties, the value is higher, you're going to get a higher mortgage. It's also important you check the rent in each of the individual properties is enough to sustain the mortgage at the higher value you're going to get for the remortgage. Okay? Very often when we buy a property from existing landlords, they've not raised the rents as much as they could, so there could be an opportunity for you to do that. So there are several things you need to check. And I just want to give you a quick reminder of those, and then I highly recommend you come and join me on the live online training to learn more about this incredible strategy. The first thing is we're looking for freehold blocks. We want no leases already created. Secondly, they have to be fully self-contained. Each property, each unit has its own electric and maybe gas supply, maybe even water supply as well. Next, the units need to be at least 30 meters squared. Otherwise, if they're smaller than that, you won't be able to get mortgages on them. Next, we need to check that the rent of the individual units is going to be enough to support a higher mortgage when we come to refinance that. And finally, we want to make sure that the purchase price is less than 75% of the cumulative value, in which case when we buy it, we can refinance it and get all of our money out. Now, there are some lenders where you can actually exchange contracts, have a delayed completion, create the leases, increase the value, and then get a mortgage based on the higher value. And I'll explain all about that on the special online training we're going to do. And actually, you can even use a purchase option and purchase lease option strategy with this. We do a deal with the owner, and actually you only buy the individual units once the higher value is being created. Again, more of that I'm going to explain on the live online training because there's a lot of detail I need to go through. But what I want to do is leave you with this message. This is an advanced strategy. It's one we teach on our 3-day Mastermind Accelerator, which is a £4,000 program. I'm giving away this strategy on this live online training because I want to help you make more money, because it's something most people are completely unaware of. And there's been a lot of talk about changes to the leasehold and freehold market, and people wonder, does this still work? In fact, it's even better than it was before. I'll explain why on the live training. So I just want to give you a quick insight. If this sounds something that might be of interest to you, I highly recommend you click on the link in the show notes, or if you're watching the video, click on the link below the description. Until the next time of the Property Magic podcast, as ever, I encourage you to invest with knowledge, invest with skill. I'll see you next time.